The villainous robots, the Sentinels, are an iconic part of the X-Men mythos, inextricably linked to the hero's struggle for acceptance in the face of bigotry. The Sentinels have now made hundreds of appearances and are as synonymous with the X-Men brand as Magneto is. But you may not know about the worst time the Sentinels ever went through, a decade where they nearly dropped off the map, frustrating rabid fanboys like me. Yes, we're taking a look at the Sentinels and their lowest point in publishing history. That's coming up next on Hero Journalism. Hello heroes, I'm 4Kade and welcome to another edition of Tales from the Quarter Bin, where we talk about comic book history and some of the quirks about collecting comics back in the Bronze Age. You know, when I started collecting comics in the mid-'80s, I was a big fan of the X-Men and the Sentinels, even though I didn't know much about them. I was really looking forward to landing my hands on whatever classic X-Men comic books I could get, whatever Sentinel appearances I could get. Little did I know, I was coming into comic collecting right onto the mid-latter point of the worst decade ever for the Sentinels. Basically, if you were collecting comics in the early to mid-1980s, Sentinel appearances were comics effectively you couldn't buy. Either you couldn't find them, or when you did, they were wildly out of your price range. And it was a combination of events that caused this to happen, a combination of obviously few appearances, but more importantly, when those appearances happened in the series, as well as a growing level of apathy from Marvel writers. If you look back to the earliest appearance, you have the Sentinel Mark I, which appeared in the early issues, the teens of the Jack Kirby and Stan Lee run. They appeared in an epic three-part series, or three-part story, and then that was it. No follow-up after that. Roy Thomas, when the series got up into about the 50s, had another resurgence of the Sentinels. He introduced the Mark II. I think that was 2 issues long, that story. And again, no follow-up after that. However, the Mark II was the first Sentinel to appear outside of the X-Men title, appearing in 4 issues of the Avengers in the early to mid-1970s. And then Chris Claremont introduced the Mark III Sentinels right after the X-Men had rebooted with the new teams, Colossus, Wolverine, etc., the team that we all know. So after that little flurry of appearances in the early 1970s, by 1977, that had kind of ended. You're basically starting a decade-long period where the Sentinels all but disappeared from the Marvel Universe. They only appeared in a handful of issues spread over that entire decade. You had 2 appearances in the Days of Future Past storyline. You had another issue in which Claremont introduced the Mark IV Sentinels. And then you had the Mark V Sentinels introduced in the New Mutants, but they only appeared for 3 issues. So, you know, that's like 5 appearances over a decade practically. So you can see that there was very little new content coming out with the Sentinels. And then if you look at the old content, that was really expensive. I mean, that sucked as a comic collector back in the day. One of my first images of the Sentinel robots was in that cool cameo in Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. I loved that. I was totally looking forward to getting Sentinel comics. And I remember walking into the comic shop one of the first times I did that as a kid and looking up at the expensive comics that they'd mount onto the walls. And I saw, I think it's X-Men 98 with the Sentinels just towering over this building coming after the X-Men. I just thought, oh my God, I got to have that. But of course, you know, it was like $20 maybe or something. I mean, that was just so far out of my range, it was a joke. In fact, I even went and dug up my old Overstreet to check it out. I looked up what that issue would have cost back in 1984, and it said $24. So yeah, there was no way I was going to be able to shell out that kind of cash for a comic. I had just started collecting comics. In fact, when I collected, basically the way I collected comic books was I had this pouch. My mom gave me this Seagram's Crown Royal pouch when I was a kid, and I would collect change throughout the week, and whatever I could collect by the end of the week or within 2 or 3 weeks, whatever, how frequently I would go to the comic shop, that was my comic collecting budget. So $24, there's just no way. And if you look at it, the early appearances, in the Lee Kirby era, in the in the Roy Thomas, Neil Adams era, both very expensive. And then Chris Claremont launches Mark III, but that's right after the reboot of the X-Men, and those issues were super expensive. And then actually, there were a couple more appearances. Basically, the main one would have been Days of Future Past. But even that, which had taken place, and I think that was published in 81, was already very expensive by the time I got into collecting around 83, 84. So now, in addition, there was the Mark V Sentinels, which were introduced kind of almost specifically for the New Mutants. But again, they only made 3 appearances. And the first one was in issue 2. Again, that would have been an expensive issue, even though it was only probably a couple of years before I started. Still, those number 1, number 2 issues are always more expensive. So, and even more frustratingly, the other Sentinel appearances in the New Mutants issues, you can't tell by the cover. So there was no way to know that those were Sentinel issues. So I would have totally missed those on the rack. I mean, I just wasn't a really huge New Mutants fan. I just couldn't quite get into them. They had all kinds of weird powers and stuff. I wanted like classic X-Men, and that was such a, unique take by Bill Sienkiewicz and such. I just couldn't get into it. So I missed those appearances too. I mean, really, I couldn't even afford the bagged and boarded issues. I mean, I bought new titles right off the rack, but most of the comics I got were from the quarter bins. And you have to realize what the pricing was like back then. New comic books were 60 cents a piece, and then you had the bagged and boarded section where you'd have comics basically starting at about $1.25 and up, and many of those would have been $4 comic books. And obviously much higher until you get to the ones that they're going to put up on the wall and such. And then you have the quarter bin, and the quarter bin would have either 25, 50, or 75 cents in very rare cases. So, I could get, a bunch of 25 and 50 cent comic books, and along with a few 60 centers that are brand new off the rack, and that would be my day at the comic shop. I almost never even really looked through the bagged and boarded issues because of that. So the fact that so many of these Sentinels appearances, they're very early in comic book history, like the Lee Kirby run. Those were rare even in the 70s, let alone in the 80s. A lot of X-Men issues didn't sell well. They had low print runs. Each appearance was at a key moment in X-Men history, or a new launch of a new title, like within New Mutants. And it was just, you could not get any of these issues. And it's so funny because I wanted them so bad. And then things did start to change a bit. Unfortunately for me, though, I was starting to phase out of comics. I was facing the peer pressure of junior high, and I ended up starting to cut back on my titles in 87, right when the Sentinels started making a resurgence, and the Mark VI Sentinels were soon introduced. So things were going to change, obviously. I just got a little bit of a bad luck for the time that I was collecting, but the Sentinels would rebound in the late 80s, and then by the 90s, all bets were off. There were a boom in Marvel titles. More X-Men titles were added. A lot of solo titles were added, like Wolverine, and Sentinels just started appearing everywhere, including non-X-Men titles. And then in 1992, they were firmly cemented as a critical part of the X-Men mythos when X-Men the Animated Series debuted with Night of the Sentinels as their premiere episode.
Unidentified mutants. Ignore.
So from then on, the Sentinels just continued to have a lot more of a presence in the Marvel Universe. And like I say, now it's probably hard to even imagine that there was a time when Sentinel comics were a real commodity. You had to really look hard and often, pay a lot to find them. I mean, that just sounds insane these days. Of course, obviously back then, a lot has changed now as far as digital availability, but back then, I mean, I remember actually specific times finding Sentinel comic books in the quarter bins. In fact, I did get that Champions appearance that I mentioned. That was a really cool issue, actually. I was bummed to find out it's the final issue of the Champions series. Of course, I had bought it several years after it was published, so I guess I can't complain too much. And I also got one of the appearances in the Avengers of I think it was the Mark II. And I mean, I love this thing. Look at this. This is beat up, just a classic beat up bargain bin. I mean, it's a little too beat up. I like them beat up. I like them shown nicely worn use, but that one's a little bit too rough. The cover, both front and back, are hanging on by a thread. And then I also got one of my greatest quarter bin finds, what I used to call one of my greatest quarter bin victories, comic shop trip victories, was over a Sentinel appearance. We'd always go down to the comic shop with a bunch of friends, and we'd always compare what we found. And that was one day where everybody looked up to me when I found X-Men 142. I mean, I'm flipping through the quarter bin and I see that cover that just reaches out and punches you in the face. It's so amazing. And I'm just like, I remember just instantly grabbing it and having this like palpitation of like, did anyone see that? Is this really supposed to be in the quarter bin? I mean, if I didn't just grab that, was someone else going to grab it? I mean, I just could not believe that I got that issue. And I never did get part 1 of Days of Future Past. Of course, now I've got reprints and digital editions and such, but back then that was literally one of the greatest comic books I ever bought. And it was 75 cents, one of the expensive ones in the quarter bin, but it actually wasn't even that beat up. So I mean, I just look on that. I'll never forget that. Actually, that's crazy when you consider how many comics a collector has, how many hundreds and maybe even I think I've probably got 1,000, but I remember that specific comic buying experience, and it was all because it was so hard to get Sentinel appearances, and they were so cool. I wanted more of it. So that's just a little note from comic book history, how there was a time when the Sentinels weren't quite the primary element of the X-Men mythos that we now expect that they are, and that the appearances that they made were quite a commodity and difficult for fans to get. So it makes you thankful for what we have today, and the fact that you can just go to Marvel streaming and get it all for one cost and not have to hunt through the quarter bins for that. So there you have it, the Sentinel's darkest point, a little bit of the comic book history of collecting comics in the Bronze Age. Thanks so much for watching. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you here next time on Hero Journalism.